Creating a garden that looks expensive doesn't always come down to how much you spend. In fact, some of the most refined, high-end landscapes are built on simple choices. Plants that perform well, repeat beautifully, and mature into something far more impressive than their price suggests. In this video, we're looking at 7 cheap perennials that look way more expensive than they actually are. Now, before we get into the list, take a second and think about what actually makes a garden look expensive. It's not just rare plants, it's structure, repetition, texture, and how everything settles together over time. The plants you're about to see do exactly that, quietly, reliably, and without draining your budget. Number 1. Lavender. Lavender is one of those plants that almost feels too simple to mention, but that's exactly why it works. It's affordable, widely available, and yet somehow always manages to look like it belongs in a carefully designed, high-end space. A small plant doesn't cost much. Seeds are even cheaper. But once it establishes, lavender transforms. The soft purple blooms combined with that silvery foliage create a calm, almost architectural effect. It's not loud, it's not messy, it's controlled, intentional. And that's the key. Expensive gardens often feel intentional. Lavender also brings something else that money can't easily buy: consistency. It grows evenly, it responds well to trimming, and when planted in rows or repeated patterns, it creates that clean, structured look you often see in professionally designed landscapes. It thrives in full sun, doesn't need constant watering, and actually prefers to be left alone once established. That means less maintenance, fewer inputs, and more long-term value. Place it along pathways, borders, or edges where its form can define space. And suddenly, what cost very little starts to look like a deliberate design choice. Number 2. Coneflower Magnus. Coneflower Magnus is the kind of plant that quietly carries a garden. It's not fragile, it's not demanding, and yet it delivers a strong visual presence that feels curated. The blooms are large, rosy pink, and held on sturdy, upright stems. That vertical form matters. It gives height, it gives structure, and it anchors softer plants around it. And here's where things get interesting. Expensive gardens often rely on contrast: soft versus bold, low versus tall, loose versus structured. Coneflower Magnus does that naturally, without needing a designer to force it. It's also extremely resilient. Heat, drought, poor soil, it handles all of it. That reliability means it comes back year after year, filling space, strengthening the overall composition, and reducing the need to replant or replace. When grouped together, it creates that full look people associate with mature gardens. Not sparse, not scattered, full. And fullness is often mistaken for expense. Number 3. Salvia caradonna. Salvia caradonna is where things start to look more deliberate. This plant doesn't just fill space, it adds rhythm. Its deep purple flower spikes rise vertically, creating strong lines that cut through softer plantings. That vertical repetition is something you'll see in higher-end landscapes because it guides the eye and creates a sense of order. What makes it even more valuable is how little it costs compared to what it delivers. It grows easily in full sun, tolerates dry conditions, and blooms for an extended period. With a simple trim, it often blooms again, extending its visual impact without additional effort or cost. But the real strength of this plant is in how it's used. One salvia looks nice. 5 or 7, repeated in a pattern, start to look intentional. That repetition builds rhythm, and rhythm is one of the fastest ways to make a garden feel designed rather than random. And again, the cost stays low. Number 4. Coreopsis moonbeam. Coreopsis moonbeam does something different. Instead of adding structure, it softens everything around it. Its pale yellow flowers aren't bold or overpowering. They're light, almost airy, and they create a gentle glow across the garden. That softness is important because without it, a garden can start to feel heavy or overcrowded. Expensive-looking landscapes often balance strong shapes with lighter textures. Moonbeam provides that balance. It forms a neat, flowing mound that fills gaps without becoming messy. It blooms for a long time, requires very little care, and continues performing even when conditions aren't perfect. What you get is a plant that quietly connects everything together. It works in the front or middle of borders, blending transitions between different heights and textures, and when used properly, it makes everything around it look more refined, not because it's expensive, but because it completes the composition. Number 5. Black-Eyed Susan Gold Sturm. This is where impact comes in. Black-Eyed Susan Gold Sturm is bold, bright, and incredibly effective at making a garden feel full and alive. The golden yellow flowers stand out immediately, creating strong blocks of color that draw attention. And here's something worth questioning. Why do bold color blocks often feel expensive? Because they look planned. When plants are scattered randomly, the garden feels unfinished. But when color appears in defined groups, it starts to feel intentional, designed, structured. Gold Sturm makes that easy. It grows densely, spreads reliably, and fills space quickly. That density helps suppress weeds, reduces maintenance, and creates that thick, layered look people associate with established gardens. It also handles heat, humidity, and neglect better than most plants in its price range. So while it looks vibrant and full, it doesn't require constant attention to stay that way. And that combination, low effort, high impact, is exactly what makes it so valuable. Number 6. Catmint Walker's Low. Catmint Walker's Low is one of those plants that doesn't try too hard, and that's exactly why it works. Its soft lavender blue flowers create a relaxed, flowing effect that feels natural rather than forced. It spills slightly, softens edges, and fills space in a way that looks effortless. But don't mistake that softness for weakness. This plant is incredibly tough. It thrives in full sun, tolerates drought, and blooms for long periods. With a quick trim, it often reblooms, extending its presence without any additional cost. What makes it feel expensive is how it moves. Rigid plants create structure, flowing plants create motion, and when you combine the two, the garden starts to feel dynamic rather than static. Walker's Low is perfect for edges and front borders, where it can soften hard lines and create that gentle transition between layers. And again, it's not expensive to buy, but it adds a layer of refinement that's hard to replicate with more costly, high-maintenance plants. Number 7. Yarrow Moonshine. Yarrow Moonshine brings everything back to structure. Its flat, golden flower clusters sit above finely textured foliage, creating a clean, almost architectural look. It's not chaotic, it's not sprawling, it's controlled. And that control is what makes it look expensive. Yarrow thrives in hot, dry conditions and requires very little care. Once established, it becomes one of the most reliable plants in the garden, returning year after year with consistent performance. But the real value comes from repetition. When you place yarrow in multiple areas of the garden, it starts to unify everything. It creates a visual thread that ties different sections together, making the entire space feel cohesive. And cohesion is often mistaken for high cost. Because when everything feels connected, it looks intentional. Now, step back for a moment. None of these plants are rare, none of them are particularly expensive, so why do they create such a high-end look? Because they follow a pattern, structure, repetition, contrast, balance. These are the things that actually define a beautiful garden, not the price of the plants. And once you understand that, the approach changes completely. Instead of asking, what's the most expensive plant I can buy? The question becomes, how do I use simple plants more effectively? That's where the real transformation happens. Part 2 continues where this idea gets pushed even further, because choosing the right plants is only half the equation. How you arrange them changes everything. Part 2 begins with a simple shift in thinking, because at this point, you already know something important. The plants themselves are not the main reason a garden looks expensive. The difference shows up in how they are arranged, repeated, and allowed to mature over time. So what actually separates an average garden from one that feels high-end? It usually comes down to restraint. Not adding more, but using less, more deliberately. Start with repetition. One lavender plant looks like a purchase. 5 lavender plants, spaced evenly, start to look like a design decision. 10 of them, repeated along a pathway, create rhythm. And rhythm is what your eye naturally follows. This is one of the most overlooked principles. People often buy one of everything. One coneflower, one salvia, one yarrow, one random plant that caught their attention. The result isn't variety, it's fragmentation. Nothing connects. But when you repeat the same plant in multiple places, something changes. The garden begins to feel unified. It starts to make sense visually. That's when it begins to look expensive. Now consider layering. Cheap gardens often look flat. Everything sits at the same height, competing for attention. There's no depth, no structure, no visual hierarchy. But expensive-looking gardens build in layers. Low plants in the front, medium-height plants in the middle, taller plants in the back. Not randomly, but intentionally. For example, catmint or coreopsis can soften the front edge. Behind that, salvia or coneflower adds vertical structure. And then something slightly taller anchors the back. Even if each plant is inexpensive, the layered effect creates depth. And depth creates that full, immersive look people associate with professionally designed spaces. Then there's spacing. This is where patience becomes part of the design. It's tempting to fill every gap immediately, to plant everything close together so the garden looks finished on day one. But that often backfires. Plants need room to grow into their shape. When spaced properly, they expand, overlap slightly, and create a natural fullness over time. That fullness looks organic, not forced. And there's a subtle difference here. A garden that is instantly full often looks crowded. A garden that becomes full looks established. That sense of maturity is what people read as expensive. Now think about color control. Not more color, controlled color. Many budget gardens use too many different shades without a clear pattern. Bright yellow next to deep purple, next to red, next to something else entirely. Each plant competes instead of contributing. But when you limit your palette, everything starts to feel intentional. For example, repeating purples and soft blues, lavender, salvia, catmint, creates a calm, cohesive look. Adding controlled accents like the yellow of yarrow or black-eyed Susan introduces contrast without chaos. The key is not removing color, it's guiding it. Because expensive gardens rarely feel loud, they feel balanced. Another detail that quietly changes everything is edging. Where does the garden begin? Where does it end? Clean edges, whether it's a defined border, a trimmed line, or a repeated row of plants, frame the space. Without that, even the best plants can look unorganized. Lavender or catmint along an edge doesn't just add beauty, it defines space. And defined space always feels more deliberate than undefined space. Now consider maintenance, but in a different way. Not constant work, strategic work. A quick trim after blooming, removing spent flowers, shaping plants slightly so they hold their form. These small actions don't require much time, but they preserve structure. And structure is what keeps a garden looking refined instead of overgrown. There's a moment where a garden either starts to look wild or starts to look designed. Often, the difference is just a few small adjustments. Then there's something most people don't think about: time. Cheap plants don't stay cheap-looking if they're given time to establish. In the first season, they might look small, slightly underwhelming, not quite what you imagined. But by the second or third season, everything changes. They fill out. They connect. They begin to interact with each other, and suddenly, what once looked like individual plants starts to feel like a complete system. That's when the garden shifts from new to established. And that established look is often what people associate with high cost, even though it was built slowly and affordably. Now step back again. If you look at the 7 perennials from earlier, lavender, coneflower, salvia, coreopsis, black-eyed Susan, catmint, and yarrow, they all share something in common. They don't demand attention individually, but together, when used correctly, they create something much stronger: a pattern, a rhythm, a structure that repeats and reinforces itself across the space. And that's the part most people miss. It's not about finding one perfect plant. It's about combining simple plants in a way that feels intentional. So before adding anything new, it's worth asking a different question. Not, what should I buy next? But, what can I repeat? What can I simplify? What can I group together so it starts to look like a design instead of a collection? Because that shift from collecting to composing is where the real difference happens. And once you see it, it's hard to unsee. A garden doesn't become expensive because of what you put into it. It becomes expensive looking because of how clearly it was thought through. If this changed the way you look at your garden, drop a comment and tell me which of these perennials you'd actually use first, and more importantly, how you'd arrange it differently this time.